February 20th, 1944. Day 1 of Operation Argument, a dangerous attempt to destroy Hitler's aircraft factories. After a vicious attack by nearly 24 enemy fighters, a damaged B-17 Flying Fortress plummets through 18,000 feet over Nazi Germany. In the cockpit, Lieutenant William Lawley fights the control wheel with torn-up hands, barely able to see through his injuries. His copilot is slumped forward on the yoke, forcing them into a steeper dive. The altimeter spins like a clock gone mad, but Lawley, dizzy from blood loss, doesn't have the strength to move his crewmate. Behind him, his men are too wounded to bail out. In the cargo bay, 60,000 pounds of frozen bombs have effectively turned them into a missile. Planners predicted 18% losses daily, and Lawley refuses to become part of this statistic. By the middle of 1943, almost 4 years into World War II, the Luftwaffe still held a powerful hand. On any given day, the German Air Force had the capacity to launch over 2,000 fighters, surrounding American or British bomber streams as they pushed inland against insurmountable odds. Furthermore, Allied intelligence reported that the Reich's aircraft industry produced between 2,000 and 3,000 new machines every month. Unless that output was reduced, the balance in the air would never shift. To meet this threat, throughout the summer and fall, the Allies launched massive bombing campaigns against Germany's industrial centers, with aircraft factories singled out as prime targets. Though powerful fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning could cover the bombers for a while, their short range meant they couldn't venture into the heart of Germany, leaving the bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone. Time and again, these raids fell short of their objectives. On August 17th, more than 200 bombers flew toward a southern German plant producing the steel bearings, while another 150 struck a fighter factory further east. By nightfall, 60 Allied aircraft were destroyed on enemy ground, while almost 100 more were beyond repair. Even when the mission was repeated 2 months later, the results were even worse, becoming known as Black Thursday, a day when out of the nearly 300 B-17s that returned to Schweinfurt, 60 never came back, and 17 more were lost due to damage. With these types of bombers having a standard crew of 10, the casualties were insurmountable. For the U.S. Army Air Force's 8th Air Force, October was known as Black Month, where more crews were lost in a single campaign than at any other time in the war. By then, it was clear the strategy simply could not hold. Flak and cloud scattered the bombs, and even when workshops were hit, crews patched them back together within days. Even the rail network, thought to be Germany's weak spot, kept moving supplies. That same month, Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, halted the unescorted raids, conceding air superiority over occupied Europe to the Luftwaffe, at least for the time being. He then began planning a new strategy to reduce the Luftwaffe's effectiveness in a method he called bait and kill, where the bombers would still go up, but now as lures, forcing the Luftwaffe into the air where American fighters could strike them head-on. As the year came to an end, Eaker's plan was bogged down by weather, limited bombers, and the lack of long-range escorts. Eisenhower, preparing for the upcoming invasion of France, wanted a commander with a more aggressive approach, and turned to Lieutenant General James Jimmy Doolittle, already famous for the Tokyo raid, to take over the 8th Air Force, sending Eaker to command the Mediterranean Air Forces. However, under this new leadership, the idea of using bombers to draw the Luftwaffe into combat could not be erased. Rather, it was about to be pushed to the limit. By late January 1944, the 8th Air Force finally had the missing piece to the bait-and-kill puzzle. Large numbers of P-51B Mustangs and P-47D Thunderbolts fitted with twin external fuel tanks, each holding 150 gallons. The Mustang was America's newcomer, a fast and agile escort with a sleek frame, built for high speeds at altitude, and armed with 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt was the proven workhorse, a massive single-engine fighter known for its toughness and its capability to take heavy damage and still bring its pilot home. Now, with twin fuel tanks slung under the wings, both types could go beyond the frontiers that had held them back only the year before. With these powerful spears finally in their hands, the USAAF High Command greenlit Operation Argument. General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, and his commanders designed argument as a multi-layered trap that would entice the Luftwaffe into a fight they simply couldn't refuse. From Britain, the 8th Air Force would launch its bombers over northern and central Germany, while Major General Nathan F. Twining's 15th Air Force would drive up from Italy, hitting southern Germany and Austria. Caught between two massive forces, there was no way the Luftwaffe could win. Concentrate against one, and the other would destroy their factories unopposed. Split their strength to face both, and they'd be overwhelmed and spread thin on two fronts. But the real change came from Doolittle's new fighter doctrine. Under Eaker, escorts had clear rules to stay glued to the bombers. Now, under the new leadership, once the bombers reached their targets, these agile P-51s and P-47s could hunt freely, diving on any German fighter the pilots wished, whether airborne, landing, or even the ones still warming up on the runway. With more fuel than ever, they could even sweep ahead to break up German formations before they even organized their attacks. This, coupled with the help of Royal Air Force Bomber Command hitting the same targets by night, had one major goal: to establish air supremacy before the invasion of France. Without control of the skies, the landing scheduled for late spring simply could not proceed. Planners knew the cost of such a bold operation would be major, with preliminary conservative estimates predicting 7% losses daily, even as high as 18. At those rates, if argument was unsuccessful, the 8th Air Force could cease to exist within a week. To ensure this didn't happen, Allied intelligence mapped the German aircraft industry down to individual machine shops, engine plants in Leipzig, assembly lines in Regensburg, and component factories scattered across Bavaria. But knowing where to strike meant nothing without the right conditions. Operation Argument needed a meteorological miracle: cloud cover over England to hide assembling formations from German reconnaissance, but clear skies over targets, a nearly impossible combination. With the invasion clock ticking, commanders couldn't wait for perfection. The moment meteorologists saw even a narrow window, Operation Argument would begin. The morning of February 20th, 1944, set to be the first day of Operation Argument, started out as a frozen hell. At bomber bases all across England, ground crews worked hurriedly in the pitch black and freezing rain, the ice forming faster than it could be cleared. With visibility down to only a few hundred feet, the bombers would somehow have to climb blind through icing and turbulence without colliding with each other. Conditions were so dangerous that even Doolittle, the master of the calculated risk, the man who'd led 16 B-25s off a carrier deck toward Tokyo in the boldest gamble of the early Pacific campaign, advised against launching. Nonetheless, by 9 a.m, nearly 1,000 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force climbed east on Mission 226, the largest American daylight strike yet launched against the Reich. One column of 417 B-17s set course for Leipzig's fighter factories. Within minutes, the weather scattered them all across central Germany. Some formations stumbled into Bemberg, where Junkers built engines, while others found Oscherslieben's Focke-Wulf plants through gaps in the clouds. Navigators aimed for anything that looked industrial, from factory roofs and rail yards to airfields. Meanwhile, 314 B-17s pushed north toward Rostock, searching for Henkel's assembly halls through solid overcast. Flying by guesswork, the pilots opened their bomb bays, hoping at least some of them would fall on their targets. But it was the third wave of Mission 226, where 272 B-24 Liberators, hunting for Brunswick, got the worst of it. Scattered across half of central Germany, Gotha, Helmstedt, Oschersleben, the groups that started together ended up 50 miles apart. Some of these Liberators went down before they even reached their targets. As the Luftwaffe rose to intercept, the German pilots expected the same easy hunting they'd enjoyed for months, helpless bomber boxes waiting to be torn apart. Instead, they flew straight into an ambush. In the skies, they found 800 American fighters waiting for them. The P-51 Mustangs dove from above. P-47 Thunderbolts swept in from the sides. P-38 Lightnings cut through their formations before they even knew what hit them. In a little over 2 hours of chaos, more than 60 German aircraft went down. Messerschmitt 110s, the twin-engine bomber killers, were caught climbing and destroyed before they could reach the B-17s. Single-engine 109s and FW-190s found themselves fighting for survival instead of hunting bombers. As the sun finally broke through over Germany, the The campaign was in full force. For most crews, the fight ended quickly, one way or another. Inside the cockpit of one of those hundreds of B-17s, one called Cabin in the Sky, First Lieutenant William R. Lawley, Jr., the lead element of the 305th Bomb Group, maneuvered the Flying Fortress seamlessly as the formation pressed toward Leipzig, a major hub of Germany's aircraft industry. At 25,000 feet, the air was razor-thin and bitterly cold, freezing breath into crystals inside oxygen masks, but pilot Lawley, on his 10th mission at the type, remained as cool as the weather. Suddenly, 20 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters rose to meet the bombers, half climbing for altitude, while the rest lined up for head-on passes, closing in on speeds of more than 500 miles per hour and leaving the American pilots in the formation with only seconds to react before the guns started firing. As countless cannon flashes winked from the lead fighter's wings, a single 20mm shell ripped past the B-17's nose, exploding in the cockpit between Lawley and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Paul Murphy. The countless fragments of metal slashed across the compartment, cutting the pilot's face and hands. Covering his face, then feeling his right arm go numb, the pilot was stunned by the shock for just a moment. As he regained composure, he looked to the side and saw Murphy slumped sideways on top of the control column, just as yet another shell tore through the bombardier station, taking his life instantly, as well as that of another nearby bombardier. A violent jolt shook the fortress just as the third engine erupted in flames. By then, the bomber was lurched nose down. Murphy's weight on the yoke was forcing it steeper and steeper into the dive. Through the windscreen, Lawley could see farmland filling the view, the smoke pouring into the cockpit, blurring the vision, its stench powerful in the pilot's mask. Despite his injuries, he clawed at his co-pilot as hard as he could, but the body would not budge. Bracing his shoulder, the pilot heaved until Murphy slid back just enough for the controls to move free. By then, the altimeter needle spun through 18,000 feet, a massive drop in only a matter of seconds. Reacting fast, Lawley locked both hands on the wheel and hauled back, his already injured muscles burning against forces that threatened to rip the bomber apart. Finally, at 12,000 feet, the aircraft's nose began to respond and steadied at last. But the formation was gone, already miles ahead. From the top turret, gunner Carol Rowley dropped down and crawled forward, ready to help. Upon finding Murphy's lifeless body in the co-pilot's seat, he pulled himself in beside him, where he saw his pilot's view and instruments were covered in blood and debris, making it nearly impossible to see. Without thinking, Rowley began reading out the gauges as best he could, calling altitudes and headings to help keep the bomber steady. But the journey was only just beginning. This damaged Flying Fortress and its surviving 8-person crew were all alone over enemy territory. With the full bomb load trapped frozen in the bay, the B-17 was close to breaking apart. The release system was gone, and fire was already spreading from an engine along the wing. Realizing how little control he had left, Lawley gave the order for his men to bail out. And realizing he could not leave them behind, Lawley stayed in his seat, thinking, no matter what, he would try to bring the bomber home. For a brief moment, the sky went quiet, the fortress clawing back speed rapidly. Then Lawley spotted them, half a dozen FW-190s dropping from behind and above, closing fast on the solo wounded straggler. As the tracers slashed through the air once again, Lawley threw the bomber into maneuvers no B-17 was meant to survive, banking and skidding until the 60,000-pound airframe groaned like it might just split apart. Through it all, his left hand clamped on the wheel, while his mangled right hand forced the throttles. Back in the waist and tail, the gunners hammered back on their own, each man fighting through the pain of their own injuries, the smoke and vibration. After a brief fight, the enemy fighters broke off, likely low on fuel and ammunition, leaving the fortress scarred but still flying. Inside, the toll was mounting by the minute. The autopilot was gone. The controls were almost completely shot out and heavy. 2 engines were silent, and thousands of pounds of bombs still hung in the bay, the stuck weight turning each mile into a struggle to keep the plane in the air. Worst of all, despite the adrenaline, shock had started to set in. Lawley's vision was starting to tunnel, his breath rasping through his mask until the pain from his wounds caused his head to drop forward on the yoke, making the bomber begin to dive once more as he lost consciousness. Upon seeing the slip through the turbulence, The nearby bombardier began to shake Lawley awake, dragging him upright and forcing his hands back onto the wheel. Finally, the pilot blinked, pulled in air, and held the fortress level again. For more than 2 hours, all across the length of occupied Europe, with smoke in the cockpit, fire licking at the wing, and the enemy waiting below, the shell-shocked Lawley did his best to keep himself, his aircraft, and his men alive. Then finally, a runway appeared ahead. Lawley scanned the airfield and saw it was meant for fighters, the runway far too short for a B-17. Even so, he committed to the landing. At his flash signal, the Canadian base scrambled to clear the strip as the bomber limped in, engines coughing and fire still raging all over it. With hydraulics gone, the fortress had no flaps and no brakes, and the landing gear had to be cranked down by hand. Lawley lined up anyway, keeping the nose high and driving the bomber in steep and fast, the only way left to keep some sort of control. As the wheels slammed down, the airframe bucked hard, and the bomber skidded across the strip. A gear collapsed, the wing dug in, and the fortress whipped into a ground loop, fire trailing as the wreck screeched to a halt in a loud storm of dust and sparks. For a long second, no one moved. Then the crews from the Canadian field rushed forward at full speed, hacking at the twisted hatches and dragging in the wounded. When the medics finally reached the cockpit, they found Pilot Lawley dazed and slumped over the controls, his hands still locked around the yoke in a tight grip. On the opening day of Operation Argument, 21 bombers and 4 fighters never came back, and hundreds of men were lost. But aboard Cabin in the Sky, 8 men survived because William Lawley refused to let go. For his actions in the opening day of Operation Argument, William R. Lawley Jr. received the Medal of Honor. 2 others were awarded posthumously that same day. One to Sergeant Archibald Matthews, a ball turret gunner, and another to Second Lieutenant Walter E. Trumper, a navigator. After both pilots on their own bomber succumbed to their injuries, the 2 men tried to bring the aircraft back to save their wounded crew, ending in a fiery crash that cost them their lives. By nightfall, a total of 2,218 tons of bombs were dropped on a dozen designated targets and 145 targets of opportunity. But the opening strikes of Operation Argument were not the end of the day's fighting. As the American formation straggled home, the air war shifted to a quieter but no less dangerous rhythm. At dusk, a handful of flying fortresses lifted off on a different kind of mission. Instead of bombs, they carried bundles of leaflets the crews dropped through their bomb bays over Tours, Nantes, Brest, and Lorient, scattering the propaganda papers before hurrying back to base. Farther north, 35 B-26 Marauders of the 9th Air Force pushed through low clouds toward Hamstedt Airfield in the Netherlands, targeting runways and dispersal areas used by German fighters. By then, the night belonged to Bomber Command, which sent more than 900 Lancasters and Halifaxes back to Leipzig. To confuse German radar, small diversionary sorties dropped mines off the coast, but the ruse failed. German night fighters, flying Bf-110s and Ju-88s, poured into the bomber stream and tore through the columns. 79 British bombers were lost, nearly 1 in 10, while dozens limped home across the North Sea, riddled with holes. The day after Lawley's battered bomber came down, the Operation Argument offensive pressed on. At dawn on February 21st, once again, the 8th Air Force sent more than 860 bombers east, covered by nearly 700 escorts. Heavy clouds hid the assigned targets, and bombs fell through gaps onto rail yards and airfields instead, leading to poor results and light losses. The air war turned savage again when, on February 22nd, 800 bombers of the 8th mounted another strike that unraveled almost immediately. One division lost cohesion over the channel, another suffered collisions in the climb through heavy clouds, and whole groups had to turn back. Out of the force dispatched, only a meager 255 aircraft found their way to their objectives, leaving the others exposed and vulnerable, and the Luftwaffe seized the chance, with countless German fighters swarming the inbound formations, attacking before the bombers even reached their targets. By the time the survivors staggered back toward England, 41 B-17s were gone, well over 17% of the effective forces committed that day. Farther south, the 15th Air Force mounted its own blow. That same day, the 15th Air Force struck Germany for the first time, dispatching 183 bombers from Italy against the Obertraubling Messerschmitt assembly plant at Regensburg. Out of the 118 that made it through to the drop zone, 14 were shot down. Combined with the 8th's losses, the day ended with 55 American heavy bombers missing, the single bloodiest of the entire week. By then, the pressure was clearly being felt in Berlin. The Luftwaffe hurriedly shifted fighters westward from the Eastern Front to reinforce the Reich's defenses, and its commanders adapted their tactics. Instead of waiting to fall on the bombers over the target, German units began launching head-on strikes while the formations were still inbound, seeking to break them up before they had a chance to release their bombs. On the morning of February 23rd, the endless snow allowed both sides to rest, giving the factories one day's reprieve and giving the Allies time to plan a heavier hit for the following day. Sure enough, on the 24th, the bombers rose again in heavy numbers, with the main targets being factories tied to the Messerschmitt Bf-110, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, and the critical ball-bearing industry. However, the strain of days of continuous flying was beginning to show. Attrition and maintenance shortages meant the 8th could send only 505 bombers, of which 451 reached their marks. Losses were steep, 44 bombers down, while the 15th, hitting Steyr in Austria, lost another 17. The final act came on February 25th, when clear skies finally opened over Bavaria. The 8th sent 730 bombers at Messerschmitt plants all across Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Fürth, while the 15th drove up from Italy with 176 more. Given the last few days, German controllers had been hoarding fighters for exactly this moment. Clear weather, bombers deep in Reich airspace. They threw everything at the 15th, tearing through the formation with desperate intensity. 33 B-17s went down, nearly 1 in 5, while the 8th lost another 31 across its 4 targets. By noon, it was over. The Messerschmitt plants were burning, but so were 64 Allied bombers across southern Germany. Senior Luftwaffe officer Joseph Schmidt stated, quote, "In the long run, our forces are fighting a hopeless battle." Though it didn't occur until the end of the war, a thorough analysis of Operation Argument came up with a much more fitting name for it: Big Week. Over the course of Big Week, USAAF flew nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties and dropped more than 18,000 tons of bombs on 18 German airframe complexes and 2 ball-bearing factories, temporarily hampering production. The 8th Air Force dropped more bombs in 1 week than it had done during its entire first year in England. However, this all-out offensive came at a heavy cost. USAAF lost 227 bombers and 42 fighters, and more than 5,000 Americans were either lost or became prisoners of war, roughly a fifth of Doolittle's force, while the 15th Air Force paid a similar toll. In total, the week's attrition averaged just under 7%, far less than the worst-case estimates, but still a staggering price. The RAF's Bomber Command dropped nearly 10,000 tons of bombs in 2,351 sorties and lost a little over 150 bombers. Even then, both commanders believed the offensive was paying off. As February ended, German fighter units had suffered unsustainable damage, losing close to 30% of their pilots and nearly 90% of their available aircraft. Factory output continued to deliver new machines, but Allied daylight bombing forced dispersal of assembly lines and complicated German industry's ability to keep pace. But there was one basic truth the Luftwaffe simply could not overcome anymore. It was too small to deal with air warfare on the massive scale the United States now waged. Critically, the Americans were in a position to quickly replace the loss of machines, and most importantly, men, whereas the German Air Force could not. Spring 1944 brought a new kind of war, as Allied bombers turned from factories to railways, bridges, and supply depots all across occupied Europe. Train engineers learned to move only at night. Truck convoys hid under trees during daylight hours. By May, the oil plant began destroying refineries and synthetic fuel plants one by one. German pilots contended with rationed fuel for training, while American crews flew twice daily. As the weeks went on, the Luftwaffe had fewer experienced pilots every day. Spring turned to summer in 1944, and the invasion Eisenhower had planned, which could not proceed without air superiority, finally had clear skies. all thanks to Big Week.